The morning everything started to unravel didn't begin with a board meeting or a dramatic memo. It began with a siren that shouldn't have gone off. At 6:43 a.m., the fire alarm in Warehouse 7 started screaming like the place was burning to the ground. No smoke, no heat, no burning plastic, just blinking strobes and a dozen confused forklift drivers staring at each other. Later, I would find out the alarm hadn't been reacting to flames at all. It had been reacting to a duplicate shipment that Atlas didn't know where to put. That was Atlas's way of clearing its throat. An ugly little cough the rest of the building treated like background noise. I was the only one who understood that cough meant something was badly out of tune. My name is Austin Cooper. I'm 47 years old, and for 22 of those years, I've been the person standing between this company and a complete digital stroke. My job title on paper was something bland like Senior Systems Architect. In reality, I was the nervous system, the heartbeat, the spine. Pick whatever metaphor you like. If it moved, pinged, printed, calculated, shipped, or paid anybody $1, it passed through something I built or maintained. 2 weeks before that alarm, I was sitting under my own desk at 2 in the morning with a can of gas station energy drink in one hand and a network analyzer in the other, tracing why Atlas had suddenly decided that every employee born in January deserved surprise paid time off. HR thought it was a cute glitch. I knew better. It smelled like Eddie in payroll had tried, again, to sneak in a little family bonus for his twins' Disneyland trip by messing with a rules file he didn't understand. I didn't make a fuss. I rolled back his change, patched the logic, wrote a note only I would ever read, and moved on. That was the arrangement. I kept Atlas breathing quietly in the background, and in return, they left me alone. No forced karaoke nights, no trust fall exercises, no mandatory fun on Fridays. Just me, the hum of the server room, and a tangle of code that looked like someone had cooked spaghetti inside a breaker box. Atlas was ugly on the inside, but it was my ugly. The backbone was old school, think mainframe-era tech that should have been retired before my daughter learned to walk, wired together with APIs and scripts I'd written to make it talk to the modern world. Cobwebs of COBOL running production schedules side by side with Python scripts pushing updates to suppliers, glued together with more duct-taped integration than I'd ever admit out loud. To an outsider, it would have looked like a Frankenstein of bad decisions. To me, it felt like dropping a turbo engine into a beat-up '69 muscle car and somehow making it purr. Nobody cared how it worked. They just assumed it did. They assumed purchase orders knew where to go on their own, that union reports appeared in the compliance portal like magic, that shift rosters rearranged themselves in the night. The executives liked to talk about digital transformation on town hall slides, but none of them could have read a log file if it was printed in neon. Down on the lower floors, I wasn't completely invisible. People in logistics called me the ghost in the wires. Grace from accounting once stuck a neon note to my monitor that said she'd have murdered Eddie with a letter opener if I hadn't fixed the printer in time for quarterly close. I took that little square of paper home and pinned it on my fridge, right next to my daughter's college acceptance letter. That's about as close to employee recognition as I ever got. I didn't play politics. I didn't hover around the CEO's office hoping to be noticed. But I did submit expense reports with very specific line items: threat intelligence subscriptions, penetration testing frameworks, advanced cert exams. Nothing glamorous, just the things that kept our name out of breach reports and regulatory horror stories. I filed them like clockwork every quarter. Nobody questioned them because they liked quiet systems and steady bonuses. They liked quiet so much they forgot who was keeping it quiet. When I first started here, I was 25 and grateful just to have a badge. It was right after a downturn. Companies were desperate for anyone willing to keep half-broken infrastructure alive. I sat through 3 management regimes, 2 recessions, and a pandemic. Every few years someone would walk through the floors with a deck about right-sizing and efficiency. But somehow my badge never got turned off. When the lights went out, they needed someone who knew which breaker to flip. Because I never trusted that goodwill, I built my own safeguards. Admin keys rotated every week. Backups lived off-site, encrypted so tightly you'd think I was guarding state secrets. There was no generic admin for Atlas. There was my name, my fingerprint, my credentials, and a web of vendor relationships that responded to my voice on the phone and nobody else's. It wasn't ego. It was survival for both of us. Then she arrived. Her name was Brooke Mason, and if arrogance had a dress code, she'd nailed it on day one. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect little lanyard holding her shiny new HR badge. Rumor had it her uncle owned a chunk of the building and had finally found a place to park her after she'd made too much noise at her last job. Her LinkedIn profile was full of phrases like change agent and culture architect, the kind of buzzwords that made executives nod and engineers quietly open Indeed on their second monitors. On her third day, I heard from my manager that she'd asked why this quiet guy named Austin kept putting five-figure security-related expenses through without proper engagement from HR. My manager, who'd seen me pull us out of enough fires, told me he'd answered bluntly. He said he'd explained that if I ever stopped buying those tools, somebody in that building would eventually lose their job or their data on the evening news. Brooke didn't think it was funny. I started seeing my name pop up in calendar invites I was never actually included in. Budget review, professional development audit, cost optimization workshop. HR loves long titles when they're sharpening a knife. First, I shrugged it off. People had tried to trim my line items before. Then I walked past a conference room one afternoon and saw something that made my stomach tighten. She was at the head of the table, a stack of pink paper in front of her, waving one sheet like a victory flag. Even through the glass, I could see the numbers at the bottom of the page. They were mine. 2 weeks later, I got the invite. All-hands meeting about Q3 morale initiatives. The kind of thing I usually ignored until someone sent me mandatory in all caps. This time, it already had that word in the subject line. I showed up in my usual uniform. Hoodie, worn jeans, black coffee that tasted like someone had filtered it through a sock, and took a chair at the back. Rows of chairs, projector humming, a slide on the screen about rewards and recognition. Corporate confetti graphics sprinkled across the border. I sat behind a pillar out of habit. It was easier to leave that way. Brooke started with jokes about how everyone had worked so hard and how there would be pizza next Friday, because nothing says you value your people like discount pepperoni. People chuckled out of reflex. I kept my eyes on the floor and let the noise wash over me. Then she clicked to the next slide. My name was the title, big bold letters. Underneath it, a subtitle about non-compliant expense behavior. My first thought was that they'd made a mistake, that this was some kind of dry compliance training scenario. Then she said my name out loud, slowly, the way teachers do when they're calling someone to the front of the class. She started describing how she'd conducted a review of professional development spending and discovered one individual who had supposedly been treating the budget like a personal playground. She didn't look at me as she said it. She looked at the CEO, then swept her gaze over the room like she expected applause. She held up one of the pink sheets, ran through totals and percentages, talking about how this one employee had used almost a fifth of the development budget in a year without, in her words, appropriate HR oversight. Every sentence was crafted to sound responsible, disciplined, brave. She didn't say I'd kept the company off dark web leak forums, that those line items represented licenses and datasets that let me block attacks before anyone else knew they existed. She just said, unauthorized, unsupervised, policy violation. I could have stood up then. I could have told them about the phishing campaign we dodged because I'd seen it hit another company first, about the ransomware probe that never got past the front door because of a tool I'd expensed 3 months earlier. I could have asked Brooke gently to list one exploit by name. She wouldn't have been able to. But as I sat there watching my name being used as a cautionary tale, something inside me went very quiet. I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was theater. The script had been written before I walked into the room. They didn't want an explanation. They wanted a sacrifice they could put on a slide. Eventually she turned toward the back, toward where I was sitting. She asked if I had anything I wanted to say to the group about my spending. The room shifted in that uneasy way crowds do when they know someone's about to be pushed. I stood up slowly, feeling 2 decades of late-night patch cycles in my knees, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the weight of how little they understood. My voice came out calmer than I felt. I told her I didn't have anything to explain to her. I watched the confusion flicker across a few faces. People aren't used to quiet men refusing to apologize. She recovered quickly. People like her spend a lot of time rehearsing out loud in front of mirrors. She announced, with the kind of crisp confidence HR saves for ugly tasks, that my employment was being terminated effective immediately. She said I needed to surrender my badge and log out of all company systems, that security would escort me if necessary. Silence hit the room like someone had killed the power. I heard a chair creak, someone's pen drop. In 22 years, I'd never once heard that floor that quiet. I walked to the long conference table, set my badge down in the middle of it, right next to a sweating pitcher of coffee. I looked at Brooke, really looked at her, and understood that she had no idea what she just pulled the plug on. I told her and everyone else in that room that they had 8 hours. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't spell it out. I just said it, turned, and walked out. Behind me, I could hear someone whisper asking if that was a threat. Nobody answered. It wasn't a threat. It was a clock they didn't know had already started. Back at my cubicle, the world looked insultingly normal. Dead little office cactus on the windowsill, 2 chipped mugs, a cracked bobblehead from a Christmas party gone bad. My monitor still showed Atlas dashboards pulsing along. Oblivious. I sat down, pulled my backpack from under the desk, and started packing. Not the dramatic movie version with slamming drawers and flying staplers. Just the soft sound of pens, notebooks, and a few personal drives dropping into fabric. I pulled open the bottom drawer and took out a small black USB stick. No logo, no branding. A strip of tape on it with 2 words, written in my rushed handwriting years earlier. Good luck. Inside that drive was everything a sane company would have begged me to walk someone through before letting me leave. Emergency runbooks, manual failover procedures, diagrams no one had ever asked to see. All of it wrapped around credentials and signatures that were tied to me, and only me. I set that drive very gently, in the center of my chair cushion, like a parting gift for whoever was brave or desperate enough to sit down after me. Then I picked up my backpack, took one last look at the sticky note from Grace, and the acceptance letter from my daughter pinned side by side, and headed for the elevator. Behind the drywall, I could feel Atlas humming through the building like a sleeping animal. For the first time in 22 years, that should have left the dock before sunrise just did. The label printer spat out a every problem could be fixed with a hammer and a secretary. He rebooted the system. Same output. The light is always. Told him the backup queue had elected to retire. That message had the sleeps in me. He told me to try again. Meanwhile, I was 2 miles away at the gas station, pouring terrible coffee into a paper cup and watching the sunrise smear across the sky. My phone was silent. It wouldn't stay silent for long. Hour 2. Payroll called down to IT. Their screens showed half the biweekly disbursements frozen in draft mode and the other half missing entirely. When they tried to run the report again, the system bounced them with a bright red banner I'd coded during a maintenance cycle. Access denied. You are not the chosen one. I didn't think they'd ever see that either. Some junior technician tried to escalate the issue to the backup administrator. But of course there wasn't one. Nobody had asked for one. Nobody had budgeted for one. Nobody had listened when I tried, years ago, to explain why redundancy mattered. They all assumed I'd always be there, like a smoke detector you take for granted until your roof's already on fire. Downstairs, panic was starting to bloom, but not upstairs. Not yet. Hour 3. Brooke walked past the operations floor with her usual overly confident stride, telling anyone who would listen that everything was fine. Legacy system quirks, she called them. Growing pains. She even told her team not to catastrophize minor glitches. If I'd still been there, I might have laughed. It was the kind of phrase someone uses when they don't actually know what a glitch is. The only person who seemed to understand the smell of real trouble was Iris from Sales Ops. She'd always had sharp instincts. She whispered to her intern that she was pretty sure I was the only one who had ever touched the core routing logic. The intern said he thought I was like a ghost, some kind of AI extension. I wish that kid was joking. IT, meanwhile, had shoved poor Caleb into my chair. I can picture him so clearly. Hunched over, hair falling into his eyes, gaming chair posture betrayed by terror. He opened the first dashboard. Red. Another. Red. Ping test. Static. Manual override. Locked. He tried every credential he had, plus a few he wasn't supposed to know. Nothing. Atlas kept responding with the same 3 words. Admin validation expired. By then I was sitting in the parking lot of a lakeside park, sipping my coffee and just breathing. For the first time in 2 decades, I didn't feel obligated to be 10 seconds away from a crisis. I felt strangely weightless and incredibly tired. Hour 4 hit like a hammer. Manufacturing stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The scheduling module began firing off production commands for parts that didn't exist, using materials the warehouse didn't stock. Supervisors stood staring at screens that insisted they start assembling phantom products. When they tried pulling up the compliance database to figure out what was going on, the entire system kicked them out and politely asked them to contact your system administrator. There was no system administrator. The union started calling. When manufacturing stops, nobody gets paid overtime. When nobody gets paid, the union smells blood. Legal tried to access some compliance filings due to a federal agency that afternoon. Atlas returned a spinning wheel, then a GIF of a raccoon lighting a trash can on fire. I'd put that GIF in the error library during the 2019 migration to keep myself sane. News trickled up to the executive wing, but slowly, because even the CEO's calendar alerts were beginning to malfunction. He walked into a board meeting that didn't exist, then stormed into operations demanding answers. Brooke was already in the war room, pacing, sweating under the collar of her designer blazer. Hour 5 was when the whisper became a scream. Someone finally opened the drawer of my old cubicle. Someone else picked up the black USB stick sitting neatly on the chair. Holly from accounting, I heard later. She'd always been braver than she looked. She recognized my handwriting on the masking tape. She carried the drive to IT like she was holding a bomb. Caleb plugged it in. 37 folders. Thousands of files. Highly detailed instructions, but all encrypted. Every single one tied to credentials that had auto-expired the minute my badge was turned off. Like I'd said, I didn't sabotage anything. I just designed a system that assumed no admin would ever be fired without a proper handoff. There was no proper handoff. The README file was a single line. Good luck rebuilding what took 22 years to get right. I didn't write it to be cruel. I wrote it because it was true. By hour 6, vendors were calling to confirm orders that Atlas was telling them had been canceled. Customers were demanding explanations for shipments that never left the loading dock. The compliance module missed a government filing for the first time in 8 years. The CFO's phone was blowing up like a grenade. Brooke still insisted publicly that this was a manageable outage. Meanwhile, she was already Googling how to restore custom admin credentials on her iPad. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. Hour 7 brought the consultants. If you've ever seen a consultant walk into a disaster they weren't prepared for, it's almost artistic. Tan vest, stainless steel travel mug, laptop covered in outdated stickers. He poked around for 30 minutes, frowned at the architecture map, then told Brooke the kind of sentence that drains the color from an HR manager's face. Ma'am, I can't override a system built like this. The root key belongs to a single certifying agent. Without that person, the system will bounce every recovery attempt. Brooke asked if we could just reset it from the cloud. He looked at her like she'd asked if he could fix the moon. He left with a branded notebook and the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd realized his billable hours weren't worth this nightmare. Hour 8 was when the board panicked. The stock had already fallen 12%. Unions were gearing up for legal action. 2 major clients were preparing breach of contract claims. Local news vans were circling the parking lot. Employees were fighting back tears. Somewhere in that building, someone finally said out loud what everyone else had been afraid to admit. We shouldn't have fired him. While all of this was happening, I was downtown, sitting in a quiet glass office overlooking the river. My coffee was warm now. My backup phone, buzzed once. A message from the company I'd been quietly interviewing with for months. Everything's ready. Conference room is open. Are you coming? I stood up, smoothed the front of my hoodie, and walked toward the door. Somewhere behind me, the city felt peaceful, like the world was exhaling. At 5:01 p.m., just as I reached the elevator, every executive at my old company received an automated email from Atlas. It wasn't from me. It was from the system itself. Root key Austin certified has been purged. Recovery requires physical reauthorization from the original administrator. This process is irreversible. And then one final notification hit their internal Slack channel. A message from Atlas. The last heartbeat of a system they assumed they controlled. Good luck. You had 8 hours. By then, I was already stepping into my new office. People like to imagine that revenge feels like fireworks. Loud, bright, explosive. But real revenge, the kind that settles into the bones, feels more like a quiet exhale after holding your breath for 20 years. It feels like finally stepping out of a room you didn't realize had been shrinking around you. That was the feeling in my chest as I walked through the glass doors of my new employer. Their biggest competitor, the company my old CEO had nightmares about during budget season. I'd been in discussions with them for months, long before Brooke printed my expense reports on bubblegum pink paper. They'd approached me through a recruiter who somehow knew exactly who the guy behind Atlas was. He said they'd heard I was underutilized, which is corporate language for, your company doesn't appreciate you, but we will. For a while, I ignored his emails. Loyalty is a stubborn habit, and I'd built Atlas like a second home. But each time HR forwarded another mandatory team-building lunch, each time a VP took credit for something that only worked because I stayed up until 4 a.m. patching a module, that recruiter's voice got a little louder in my head. The night before the morale meeting, the meeting where Brooke planned my public execution, I finally said yes. We scheduled a follow-up for the next week, and I began quietly disentangling myself from the system I'd spent half my life building. I cleaned personal files off my dev environment, documented the things that legally required documentation, removed old drafts and scratch notes that would confuse any future engineer. I didn't sabotage anything. I just prepared to leave cleanly, the way a surgeon would step out of an operating room after 20 years of stitching up the same wound. So when Brooke stood there with her smug smile and declared I was terminated effective immediately, I wasn't blindsided. I was freed. And now here I was, sitting across from the CEO of a competitor who actually looked me in the eye when he shook my hand. His people didn't talk about pizza parties fixing morale. They talked about infrastructure resiliency, long-term architecture, true modernization. They talked my language. The CTO slid a folder across the table. A simple contract with a number on it that made me blink. The title under my name read, Chief Technology Officer. 40% salary increase. Better benefits. Flexible hours. A team of engineers who didn't think legacy systems were mythical beasts. But what mattered more than any of that was the sentence on page 3. Employee agrees not to transfer or disclose proprietary code or data belonging to previous employer. I insisted on that clause. Revenge wasn't worth breaking the law or cutting corners. I wasn't here to steal. I wasn't here to hack. My old company's collapse would come from its own arrogance, not from anything I touched. All I brought with me was knowledge, architecture philosophy, workflow patterns, the kind of scars someone only earns from 20 years of taming a creature like Atlas. Knowledge isn't proprietary. Knowledge is a weapon the person being underestimated is entitled to carry. I signed the contract. The CEO stood, shook my hand again, and welcomed me aboard. It felt strange, being treated like someone whose experience mattered. They even gave me a key card with my name embossed on it, not just printed. Nobody had ever given me that before. While they walked me through the office, my backup phone buzzed again. A voicemail from my old employer. Then another. And another. HR. The CEO. Legal. Even Caleb, who sounded like he was hyperventilating into a paper bag. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, when we reached my new office, a corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows, I walked in slowly, letting myself savor the moment. I placed my backpack on the wooden desk, pulled out a notebook, and sat down in the leather chair overlooking the river. For the first time in 22 years, I didn't feel like I was sitting inside a server closet pretending to be part of a company. I felt seen. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a voicemail. It was a notification forwarded from the news app one subscribed to. Major system failure at local manufacturing giant. Operations halted. Sources say internal administrator recently terminated. I locked my phone and set it face down. Not my circus. Not my problem. Not anymore. Later that evening, just as the sunset was turning the water below orange and gold, the CTO knocked on my door. He asked if I wanted to join the leadership team for dinner. I hesitated before answering. It had been a long time since anyone invited me anywhere without needing me to fix something. Yeah, I said finally. I'd like that. We left my office together. As the door clicked shut behind me, something inside me clicked too. Something that had been stuck for a long time. I didn't know yet what was happening back at my old company. But the universe has a funny sense of timing. While I was eating grilled salmon and enjoying a glass of wine with my new coworkers, the board at my old employer was apparently screaming at each other. The union was calling lawyers. Vendors were threatening penalties. A government agency had issued a warning about missed filings. Stock price had dipped another 4%. I didn't learn any of this until the next morning, when my old colleague Holly emailed me. Not from her company account, but from her personal one. She didn't ask for help. She didn't try to guilt me. She just wrote, "I'm sorry. You deserved better." It was the closest thing to closure I would ever get from inside those walls. But the real final act came just before noon. My old employer didn't send it. Atlas did. The email went to the entire executive team, but someone on the inside forwarded it to half the company, and someone else posted it on Reddit. It was written in the same tone Atlas always used for major system notifications, cold, precise, a little too formal. Root admin key Austin certified has been fully purged. Reactivation requires in-person verification from original administrator. This action cannot be reversed. Minutes later, the last Slack message ever sent by Atlas slid across every monitor, frozen forever in screenshots. Good luck. You had 8 hours. People asked if I'd programmed that message on purpose. The truth? I honestly couldn't remember. I'd written a lot of fail-safes over the years, some at 3 in the morning while muttering sarcasm into a keyboard. Maybe it was mine. Maybe it wasn't. But it was fitting. When you remove the spine, the body collapses. When you fire the one person who knows how the skeleton fits together, the collapse is slow, inevitable, and entirely self-inflicted. In the weeks that followed, I heard things, rumors mostly. The CEO was pushed out. Brooke was transferred to a field office in another state, stripped of all decision-making authority. Several engineers quit and joined places that treated them like humans instead of replaceable parts. Holly sent me one more email telling me she was interviewing elsewhere and finally felt hopeful. As for me, I found something I hadn't expected. Peace. I took my daughter to tour her new campus without checking my phone every 5 minutes. I slept through the night without waking to imaginary alert tones. I went on runs. Real runs, outside, where sunlight hit my shoulders instead of fluorescent bulbs. And some nights, when the office was quiet and my new system prototypes hummed softly on the screen, I'd look out at the river and think about the company that spent 2 decades pretending I was invisible. They didn't lose because I fought them. They lost because they taught me exactly how fragile they were without me. Real revenge isn't about destruction. It's about subtraction. You don't burn the house down. You just walk out the door and take the blueprint with you.